It's my pleasure to introduce our final panel, which is called the Women Owning Woodlands, or WOW. And our moderator is Fran Cafferata-Coe, who is a certified wildlife biologist that works in the forest industry. She also helps run and manage her family's 350-acre woodland, where she is busy turning in a right-of-way from invasive plants to wildlife habitat for songbirds, deer, and elk. Fran's life experience has been working towards helping people manage woodlands for multiple uses, which fits with the mission of WOW. If you are new to forestry or interested in owning or managing your own forest, WOW is a great resource and network for you. Please help me in welcoming Fran and her panel.
Thank you, Megan. It's really just an honor to be here. You know, like Angie, I got to know Bill too. I didn't meet him until he was in his 90s, but I was still impressed that every time I saw him, he remembered my name and would be sure to say hello. And so it's just an honor to be here, and I know he would just love that we're all here talking about forestry today. So thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, Women Owning Woodlands, you know, you wouldn't really think it maybe today, given all the women speakers we've had up here, but it's really a male-dominated workforce. And so Women Owning Woodlands is an opportunity for women to come together and talk about forestry in a real safe environment and to build each other up and to learn skills from each other and to feel confident when we're out managing woodlands. And we've heard a lot about from big timber companies and the Forest Service and BLM and just big public ownership, but we're here really representing small woodland owners in private forestry. So I'd like to take a few minutes and introduce my panel. You might recognize on the end, Edie is back with us. She was in Act 1, but we brought her back for Act 3, but I just want to, so I don't need to reintroduce her, just except to say that she's been a fan of trees her entire life, and she lives in Seattle with her husband, her 3 children, her dog, and 2 chickens. So I don't know, we got that part of the viral before. And then next to her, and I just should say, we've had this real emphasis on emerging voices and young foresters, but we've heard from a lot of biologists, and that we've just really think about being inclusive in forestry. And it's really, forestry is multi-generational, and that's really another focus of this panel. As you can see from all of us up here, we're not all of us the young emerging voices, but it's important to hear from all generations in forestry. So Sarah Domling grew up on a family forest in the Willamette Valley. And her family came over on the second wagon train in 1844. Her great-grandfather owned a sawmill on the waterfront in Portland. She has her bachelor's in political science from Whitman College and her master's from Reed College. She taught high school in Portland and elementary school in the Navajo Reservation in Arizona. She manages 1,400 acres of the Xena Forest, and she's been doing that for 20 years since the death of her husband. She has 4 children and 4 grandchildren, all close to home and all who help manage the forest. And if she has any spare time at all, she's really interested in land use and climate change, both which really have an influence on forestry. And then our next panelist is Wilda Cafferata, which I had no trouble pronouncing her name. Grew up backpacking in the high Sierras and has been backpacking ever since. She has her bachelor's in English from Berkeley and her master's in education from the University of Oregon, although I have to point out that all of her children went to Oregon State. And she taught high school and middle school in Chiloquin and Pleasant Hill for 20 years, has worked with student teachers at the U of O for 10. My mom writes poetry. She and her husband have 4 children. 2 are engineers, one's a forester, and one's a biologist. And she and my dad co-manage the Cafferata family forest, and they've been doing that for the last 9 years. And so the previous panels did kind of a self-introduction, but what we would like to do is have you all get to know us through the questions. So we're going to jump right into it, and we invite you to get to know us in the next 45 minutes. So, Edie, why don't you tell us where your forest property is?
Sure, thank you. And before I begin, I want to add that Fran and I both have 3 older brothers, so we have been able to commiserate. And I actually thought that I would be off the hook. She's got one of her brothers in the room. I don't have any of my family here, but then I remembered that this was being videotaped, so maybe I can't say whatever I want. So anyway, so I am actually really fortunate. I think I'm living the perfect life here because I've been able to dip my fingers into 3 small forestry properties. The largest of which is the I'm a 4th generation tree farmer in South Carolina. And I own that together with my 3 brothers and then 2 other cousins. At one point in time, there were 12 cousins, and already in the next generation, there are 13. My parents are part of a 12-family partnership that owns some property in northern New York. And this is mainly recreation. Everyone has an individual cabin on a lake, but all in the woods. And so I am the head of the forestry committee, and we do active forest management every year. It's mainly for improving forest health, but also it generates some income to help with operating expenses. And then most recently, my husband and I here in the Northwest bought a very small amount of property in north central Washington. It's very dry sagebrush, but also some pine as well.
Sarah, same question. Where's your property?
The Xena Forest is in the Eola Hills, which most of you probably know is west of Salem. And it's that sort of special ecosystem that isn't the Coast Range and it isn't the Cascades. It's the Valley Hills, which have a big preponderance of hardwood along with Douglas fir. So from my kitchen window, I can see the Coast Range and Highway 99W, and looking the other way would look over towards Salem and the main part of the valley.
Where's your property, Wilda? Or Mom?
Well, we're fortunate enough to have 4 pieces of property. And really, when you have 4 pieces of property, it's like having 4 children. You know, they're all different in a lot of ways, and in a lot of ways they're all the same, and they have different needs. So 2 in Lane County, and 1 in Benton County, and 1 in Lincoln County.
So now that we know where their forest property is, let's find out why they own Woodlands. Sarah, why don't you tell us a little bit about why you own Woodlands?
Okay. It's a very long story that would take the whole rest of our time, so I'll give you an abbreviated version. If anyone's curious, it's kind of an interesting story. My husband managed the property for about 10 years before he passed away, and he managed it for a German landowner who we happen to know, having lived in Germany before that. So when he passed away, I was offered the opportunity to continue managing this land, and I said, well, the choice was going back to teaching school or forestry, and it was an easy choice because my trees don't talk back to me. I chose the challenge of learning to be a forester, and the head German forester, this is very large timberland owners in Germany, who've owned forest for 450 years, so they have a different time perspective than we tend to. So they gave me a crash course, 3 months of head forester every day in the woods. Wow. And I learned a lot about what they thought I needed to know, which has been revised in the last 21 years by my being in Oregon and not in Germany. So 10 years later, they decided to sell this property for very good reasons that are complicated. And I went into a total tailspin and thought we were going to live in the middle of a clear cut pretty soon. And after 2 years of elaborate negotiations and lots of miracles, BPA, Bonneville Power, has mitigation obligations for all the habitat they've destroyed with dams and power lines. And in the Willamette Valley, the critical habitat to be protected is oak, because there's something like less than 5% of the original oak left that was here when the settlers came, when those wagon trains came. And so we were the first working lands easement for Bonneville, and they bought the development rights on the entire forest. So it's forest forever, but the working lands part means that we have a dual mandate of conservation of oak habitat, and commercial forestry. So that set me on my road. That's how I happen to be here. And I had 2 children still at home. I wasn't quite 50, so you can figure out I'm pretty old now. Not under the 45. They said, we don't have to move, do we? So we haven't. We're still there and will be forever.
That's wonderful. Edie, how about you? Why do you own Woodlands?
Well, I think I know, but like many other small landowners in the U.S., it's from family. So I was born into owning owning Woodlands, and that sort of, we call it the land holding gene, I think was probably passed down from my grandfather. So it was my great grandfather that actually originally bought this abandoned rice plantation in South Carolina, but his son-in-law was my grandfather, who had come over from Denmark, and he was part of a farming family, and land was really important. And he saw this opportunity. He said, I want to buy this from you. And so my grandfather was the one who bought it from his father-in-law and started planting trees on it. And it has been passed down from generation. And I have always enjoyed the outdoors and really kind of grasped onto the tree part about it.
Oh, that's wonderful. What about you?
Well, my husband and I came late to the party. We only owned our land for about 9 years. And it's always been a goal of ours to own land. So when I came to this question of, why do you own your land? And I thought, well, I own it because I want to. And then I try to dig a little deeper into that and say, well, why do I want to? And it was really interesting questions. I'm glad you asked that, Fran. I grew up on the beaches of Southern California, and I didn't really see trees, occasional palm tree. But then I've always been a bookworm, and I brought a prop along. This is one of my first little golden books. And as you can see, it's been very well loved. And it's The New House in the Forest. And it's all about Judy and Johnny, or whatever, Jimmy Jenks, whose parents built a house in the forest. And I was just enchanted by this story. I read it. And there, after that, I've always been a bookworm. There was more books. There was Little House in the Big Woods, and there was Heidi. And I think that started my love of, there's a forest out there somewhere. It's not all a sand dune. And so that morphed into a dream of having a forest. And so eventually, we had time in our lives after we raised all these children and put them all through college and all of that. And now we have our forest land.
I think that's great. I think that just listening to their answers makes me have to ask this next question, which, we're just talking about women owning Woodlands, and it's a largely male-dominated workforce, which is great too. We all have a lot of things to offer. But so, Edie, I'll have you start us off on this one. What do you think women offer that's unique in terms of managing woodlands?
Yeah, that's a tough question, and I think that it really depends on your unique circumstance and where you're coming from. But the more I thought about it, there are kind of two things that I think stand out. One, and I'm not going to lie, it's for better for worse. This is when you're dealing with the actual people who are managing the land, whether it's the forestry consultants or the contractors or other things. You as a woman, they're not quite used to dealing with a woman landowner. There's no bad bias against it. It's just something that's not, run-of-the-mill, day-to-day, not quite as used to. And I think that is changing, but I've definitely had experiences where I know that, talking to the logger who's out on a site, it's sort of like, well, why are you out here? And why are you so interested in this? That's one thing. The other one is when you're dealing with the other people, whether it's family members or whether it's other people in a partnership. I have always felt like whatever I bring to the table, the suggestions that I make, I need to be very prepared. and come with facts and come with backup and have thought through, which is a great thing. But some of it comes with saying, do you really know what you're talking about? And in fact, most of the time, because I have a forestry background, do. But ultimately, I think it makes the decisions better because it really does force me to be prepared and to make the case.
Yeah. Sarah, what do you think?
I think it's a hard question. I'm not sure there's a big difference. I think there's more difference between people from A to Z in their orientation than there is between men and women. I think, I know that we often say that forestry is a combination of art and science. And I definitely tend more toward the art and intuition side than the science side. But that's not to say that some men don't do that, and some women are very data-oriented. So I'm not sure. I feel very nurturing about my little trees, which came along when my children were sort of grown, which I enjoyed nurturing too. So it's kind of a substitute for children. So now I have grandchildren that I can nurture with the little trees. I really don't have a good answer to that. I think
that's a great answer.
The more people that have forests, the better, whoever they are.
I think that's good. What about you, Mom?
Well, I agree it's a hard question, and it's hard to answer without sounding sexist. I don't want to sound that way. But I do think that women bring two, maybe not unique, but somewhat unique approaches to forestry and forest management. And one of them is that I think in general, women tend to be more flexible. Just because we've had to make so many compromises in our lives. I think probably every woman knows that. So on our forest, we have multiple objectives. And I think it's easier for me in my position in the family to find balance among those objectives. Whereas it seems like some of the men in our family say, oh, well, this is going to be timber. And I said, well, we have wildlife and we have timber. And we have all so it's easier for women to balance, I think, than for men. So that's maybe unique and something we bring to the table when we're managing forests. And the other one I think Sarah mentioned is just the nurturing. I love our forest land. I love it with a real passion. Not that men don't, because I know they do, but I just think there's something maternal almost about growing things.
Well, I think those are really honest and heartfelt answers to a really tough question. And, I think it's important for us all to embrace that we are different and we come to managing forests from real different backgrounds, but that we all come together and respect the differences that we bring to the table. And that's really powerful that we can all work together to manage woodlands and with our unique perspectives. You mentioned being passionate, and that brings me to this question, which I think is really, and this is a tough one too, maybe, because you can say, what are you most passionate about? And that could be anything. But in terms of your forest land, Mom, what are you most passionate about?
Well, when I was teaching, in my career as teaching as a school teacher, I learned to avoid questions that said, what are you most something about? I would rephrase that to, what are some of the things you are passionate about? Because there are so many, and just trying to highlight one would be very difficult. But trying to answer your question, I think probably the sense of contribution you get from being a responsible landowner that sustainably manages your land. I think I'm really passionate about saying, I really care about all these forestry issues, and I wish I had more influence in the state, and if I ruled the world, it would be a better place, but at least I can make a difference on my acres. So I think that's probably what I'm the most passionate about.
Yeah, that's great.
Well, this is my favorite question.
Oh, great.
And I agree with that. If I owned all the forests in Oregon, everything would be fine. And I am passionate about leaving the healthiest, most resilient forest that's protecting the water and the air and the soil and the biodiversity, not just for my children, but for Oregon and for all of us, because forests are the best ecosystem out there for our future. They protect a lot for us. And underneath that, we are wanting very much to be a model of the fact that economy and ecology can really, in the long term, be exactly the same thing. one doesn't exclude the other. And this may be controversial, but we practice forestry very differently than the industrial model of forestry. And we don't clear cut, and we don't use chemicals to release the little seedlings. And I'm a total Nazi about compaction of the soil, to the despair of my loggers. And it's another way of doing forestry, and it's a very long conversation about the economy and the ecology, but that's number 2 on my list. And number 3 on my list is that we have, and I couldn't pick one above the others, we have all these hardwoods, and there is no hardwood industry in Oregon. Anecdote to tell you this, my first logger 20 years ago, when he was about to cut down an oak tree to get to a fir that he wanted to cut, I said, can't cut down the oak tree. What? We just threw that stuff down the canyon. And he'd been logging for decades in Oregon. So hardwood, maple and oak, our primary hardwood species, have been considered nuisance trees in Oregon since white people came here. And it's a shame. And other parts of the world, as some of you know well, live off of hardwoods. Mm-hmm. My son went to Indiana to get hardwood veneer made because there's no infrastructure for it here. They have no conifer natives. It's all hardwood. And they have a big industry. So this could get too long, so I'll just say we now have a small sawmill where we process hardwoods, and we sell flooring, we sell lumber for furniture and cabinets and for tabletops and all that, which relates to a question that was asked earlier. So if anybody's interested, I will talk your ear off about how important it is to make all of our neighbors in the Willamette Valley realize that oak can be an asset instead of a liability, as well as the other hardwoods, to your forest and to your pocketbook over time. And we'll buy your logs. If you're not converting to vineyards or houses. Thank you.
You can feel the passion in these women for their woodlands. What about you? What are you passionate about?
This is really exciting because Sarah just gave some great examples about exactly what, kind of through learning experience on different forest properties, what I've really learned to be passionate about. And I think coming at each of these properties with different objectives, I have come to realize that, in addition to what the main objective would be, which, in South Carolina really is an investment, and it is bringing, generating income, none of which we actually get, but it's generating income. The other one is recreation, hunting, different, primary objectives. There's a real importance to have forest management be a part of that. And in some cases, in many cases, even if your objective isn't income from the forest, for the forest health reasons, you really need to be doing something with your forest. And one of the things I didn't appreciate about that is that you need a market for all the material that comes out of that forest.
Yeah, absolutely.
For example, in upstate New York, we do have hardwood forest, and it's, the oaks and the maples, and it's the good quality saw timber, and that is the primary focus. But in order to get those forests out and have that saw timber, you want to make sure that the next generation that's coming up is also the oak's seedlings. Now, it turns out that deer really, really love oak seedlings and maple seedlings and all the seedlings that we love too, but they don't like the beech and the other stuff. And so when you're left with a forest, you want to make sure that you are taking out some of that low value, the beech and the others, and really finding a way to have the oaks grow. And in order to do that, you have to have a market for this low-value material, which is tough. Last year, for example, we wanted to do a saw timber cut, a shelter wood cut, which is what you do when you're in uneven forest management and mixed hardwood forest. And some pulp mills had shut down in Maine. which caused flooding of all of the pulpwood across the Northeast, which meant that there was no logger who would do a saw timber cut because they couldn't have you've got other volume that's associated with it, and they had no place to put the pulpwood associated with it. And it was just, we were left, we had a cut that we had identified, we wanted to do it, and no one would do it for an entire year and a half.
Wow.
So it's a learning experience, but something that I'm learning to be passionate about.
Yes, absolutely.
Some
But
things are-
we're so passionate about this, about owning woodlands, and so we want to play off of each other a little bit. And I know that Sarah and Wilda both have another thing to add, so we're gonna stay on this question for a little bit. And so Sarah, first you, and then
Some
Wilda,
things
you.
are different here. And my deer don't like my hardwood seedlings.
Oh,
They
there
like
you
your
go.
cedar, don't they?
Nope.
No. What do they
And
like?
that's another interesting topic. But also, we have a hunting, we think we can have it all. We have a hunting program on the property, and we have recreation on the property, and we have conservation, and we think a forest can be good for everything and everybody. And we don't sell pulp. Pulp is the crummy little trees that don't make lumber. We think it's good fertilizer for the soil. And so we leave it on the ground. So there are options, but it's all an ongoing conversation of different objectives and so forth. But just
I'm glad you said that, because what I wanted to add, I'm passionate about, is being able to use all the tools available for forestry to have really solid forest management. So I know, Sarah, you mentioned you don't use herbicides. We do use herbicides, and I think it's fine that you don't, and it's fine that we do. There's lots of tools out there, and I'm really passionate about having laws and policies that let us use the appropriate tool for the appropriate job to meet the appropriate objective on all of our lands.
Absolutely. I agree with that too. And we talked about, I just have to say that land that we're converting from a Scotch broom plantation into deer and elk habitat, my parents both get out there on the backpack sprayer, and they even had me on the backpack sprayer out there, and you just wouldn't believe the mecca that it is for songbirds now. They've just turned it around. It's amazing. If anybody wants a tour, we would be happy to give you a tour of that. Anything else that anyone wants to add about why you're passionate about your woodlands, or we move on to another question? We'll move on. I think we've had some questions from the audience that are sort of on my list, so I think we'll bump to this one, which is, what advice would you give to a new woodland owner? Because I think maybe you might be inspired from this if you don't already own woodlands, and you might think, maybe I should be owning woodlands. And so we've got all this experience up on the panel here, so we'll go with what advice would you give a new woodland owner? Let's see. Edie, do you want to start?
Sure. So one is, don't be afraid to ask questions, obviously. Nobody knows everything at all. And as this is a new world, and there's each forest, each forest in, each county, each neighboring thing is going to have a slightly different scenario, a slightly different set of interactions that are going together. So it's really important to not be afraid to ask questions, to get help from the amazing extension and all sorts of people who are willing to help. But I would say that what I have recently realized is one of the most important things is to write stuff down. And I don't mean in a way, these are the things that are going to happen on your property. And they're things that you're going to say, I want to do a little experiment here. I have this noxious weed that I have to, give to the Okanagan County every year. And I want to, I'm going to remember how many musk thistles I pulled out last year. And 5 years go by and you realize you don't remember what happened, 4 years ago. So just write it down, because you're in it for the long term. And if you have that ability to have this information on a particular piece of property over a long term, it's kind of incredible.
Yeah,
I think.
Mm-hmm.
she's right. I will do it.
Wilda, what about you? What advice would you give to being fairly new to the game yourself?
Well, first I want to second what you said about writing things down, and a good place to do that is a management plan. And when you have your property, if you're new to having a property, having a management plan is just great, because it's a place that Well, you can put all kinds of things in your management plan, but it sort of gives you a guideline for where you're going, what you want to accomplish, and you can write down those kind of records. And ours, we put the poetry I write goes in our management plan because it's multi-file. So
Great.
I like that.
It's like this.
I think this is advice to a new landowner.
Yeah, advice to you.
Well, I would say don't think you have to do everything at once. You know, it can be very overwhelming to look at that. Here's this piece of land you're all of a sudden responsible for, and you think, my gosh, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. You can take it slowly. The land's going to be there. You know, if you make mistakes, you make mistakes, and you can recover from them and move on. So don't be afraid just to sort of start slow. And then the other piece of advice I would give is to enjoy your property. I mean, sometimes we get so carried away, we just work. We prune, and fertilize and so forth. But just sometimes take some time just to walk around your property and say, my gosh, look what I've got. You know, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah. Sarah, what about you, having been a long-time landowner? What advice
I will
would
just reinforce in my own way. I wrote down, ask lots of questions, and this came about because the Germans taught me a lot, but they didn't teach me the English lingo that I needed to be a forester. And my first moment of terror was when the first log buyer came, and I was standing in front of a deck of logs trying to tell him why I wanted to sell these logs to him, and I didn't understand anything he was saying. And I was afraid to admit that I didn't understand what he was saying for fear he would take advantage of me, which all was a complete crock. And eventually I learned, I asked a question months later, and I learned that those log buyers are the nicest guys, and they'll tell you more than you ever wanted to know about what they're doing, what those words mean. And that began a whole new layer of education for me. So don't be afraid to ask questions. They're pretty nice guys out there. And the other one was be patient. When I started at age 50, I thought, oh, this is awfully old to be starting growing trees. And here I am with trees I planted that are way taller than I am, and things change faster than you think. So be patient and enjoy it.
Anything you want to build on any of that, or move on to the next question? What do you think? We'll move on. We've got some
sound advice.
Nope.
Well, that's just
One more.
I think asking questions is a good thing, and also asking questions of multiple people, because you get different answers, and then you can kind of think, oh, what, and sort of compare and contrast those in your mind. Like there's certainly the WowNet is a great place to ask questions. The extension agents, because the Society of American Foresters is super. They have all kinds of technical information they can give you. So I think it's really important to get a diversity of answers.
And I would say some of the best advice I ever got was to this, you have a very hard question and you can't decide what to do. And this was a German forester who was very impatient with me. And he said, Sarah, if it's a really hard decision, it's probably okay either way.
Yeah.
That is not only good in the forest, it's good in life. So I kept that one.
Great
with me.
advice.
That's a good one.
That's kind of a lead into where so they've all said we ask questions, and that's great, and we have got some audience questions too, but where do you ask the questions? What besides WowNet, which is a great resource, what other areas do you get your information from? Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I just said some, but I think another really good place to get information from is going on tours of other people's land, because pretty often for a new landowner like myself, I don't know what questions I've got. I didn't know I had questions about this or that or the other thing until I go on someone else's land and see what they're doing. It's just a real minor example. We were on a tour, and they had people taking PVC piping and put it over all of their. They had stakes to mark out their culverts and things, but they put PVC white piping over them to mark those even more clearly. So when you're driving through the property, you're not going to run over the edge of the culvert or something. And I didn't know, it hadn't occurred to me to ask, what should I do to mark my roads? And it wasn't on my horizon. So I think those tours can be really useful, and there's lots and lots of tours out there. In fact, if you devote yourself to tours, you never have time to work on your own property because you'd always be going to somebody else's. But they're very useful.
One place for those tours is the neighbor tours that are put on by the Oregon Small Woodland Association and the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. So you can get on either of their websites to learn more about those tours. Any informational sources you want to add,
Sarah or Edie? Well, mine would be, there's another forestry organization besides the SAF, which is the Forest Stewards Guild, to which I've been a member for many years, and it's the Eco-Foresters of America. It's also a national organization, but a little more my style of forestry. So I've had lots of good contacts and mentors there. And then my German foresters are still coming around.
How do we get access to your German foresters?
I'm afraid of your German foresters.
I would say, so for me, consulting foresters are, a great resource, and also extension forestry. In fact, our property in upstate New York, we actually have an experiment with deer browsing on one of the extension foresters, who's also a professor at Cornell, has put into place, which is kind of cool to be able to be a part of an actual study. And then American Forest Foundation, we haven't mentioned them, but they're a great resource. They have an actual, what's it called, My Land Plan? So a whole series of resources that are just for small landowners and really walk you through land management, succession planning. They just have a wealth of knowledge there. And then I would say in Washington State, we have the Washington Farm Forestry Association. And we also in Okanagan County deal with the Noxious Weed Board, which are also a wealth of information. So
I think it
you
can
get a lot of
There's
things.
so many places out there to get
And
information.
I do say I'm super excited to talk to folks who are in the WOW network. I've been sort of on the listserv, but not really been an active member, and I think that's really important to, as a wealth of knowledge there.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. Well, we have a little bit of time left, and I've got some audience questions, so I think I'm going to maybe put mine down for a minute. And so this is a great question from the audience. It's a tough question, and it's a surprise question, so bear with us. What are the most difficult obstacles that you've had to overcome as a woman owning woodlands?
Oh.
I'm going to give you just a second.
Well, I can, it doesn't have to do with me being a woman. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's absolutely.
It has to do with how I practice forestry, and the way we practice forestry costs more than 40-year rotation clear cuts in many ways. And our extreme protection of those Commonwealth values of water and air and soil and biodiversity comes with a cost, and those other values of the forest aren't recognized in any way financially. So the playing field isn't even. If you practice forestry like this or like this, however you want to do it, it's a different financial equation. And my interest would be in public and policy and political recognition of these different kinds of forestry and some acknowledgement of that, not just a pat on the back, Granny, but real acknowledgement that according to the contribution, there should be some way to make it work financially. Because the interesting thing is I have had probably 1,000 discussions over the last 20-some years with industrial forest folks, none of whom have ever objected to how I practice forestry, but they've only said it doesn't pencil out. So that's my biggest obstacle.
Yeah. Either of the Wilda or Edie, do you have anything to add to that? Biggest obstacle?
Biggest obstacle, oh gosh. So, and again, it doesn't have to, I don't think it's from a woman perspective.
Anybody would answer that.
Maybe I'll add, just because I'm kind of the next generation down in this, and this is, across the U.S., we have 10 million landowners. The average age is, I'm making it up, 65. I was going to say something in the 60s, but you do have you have a situation where you have landowners that are aging and either passing it down to the next generation or selling it off, or it's fragmenting. And And there are some real issues with succession. There's issues, the next generation, and as you keep going down, there are a couple different ways that you can go about doing it. I think it's really difficult when, it's one of these things, it's probably a catch-22, because having the land probably brings your family closer together. You've got a place that's, well, that's so you've got a situation where you've got an incredibly close family, but then you also have this incredible asset that you now have to figure out how to manage together, and it gets tricky.
Yeah.
I'm going to stop right there.
Good idea. Wilda, do you have anything to add to that, like obstacles you've had to overcome in owning Woodlands?
I think my biggest obstacle, and maybe my only obstacle, is my own lack of self-confidence. And again, I just, came late to the party. I didn't have a forester background, and just learning to have confidence in myself and the ideas that I have, because I'm married to a forester who's been a forester all of his life, and who am I to come in after, the last 10 years and say, well, I don't think we should do it that way. And I'm pretty familiar with those pats on the back, But I think we can learn to have confidence, but it's something that I myself need to work on every day.
Yeah. We have just a few minutes left, and I love this question that I got from the audience, so we're going to take the time to do it. And that is, this has been a summer, right? We've had forest fires out there. There's disease out on the forest land, and we talk a lot about healthy forests. And so, if your land experienced a major loss, wildfire, catastrophic, disease, would you start over? Would you just throw in the towel?
Yes, start over.
Start over.
I can answer that firsthand.
Yeah, I want
because,
right.
Because our cabin burned down 2 years ago in the largest forest fire in Washington State history, and we just broke ground 2 weeks ago, I think. So we are starting over. I mean, it's a slightly different. Where the forest piece of it. Some burned, some didn't, depending on where it was, and it's kind of an interesting scenario there. But yeah, I mean, I never thought that you would actually experience, a full loss, and it's actually okay. There is a renewal, and especially in the forest. Gosh, fire in its own right, when you're not in a super high intensity stand replacing fire, if you've had, too much undergrowth in there, it's such a regenerating thing. It really is an incredible thing. But, everything is, in pieces, and, you want everything in moderation here.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Mom? Would you start over if our forest burned down?
Oh, absolutely. I thought about it because we had some fires burn fairly close to our property. Thankfully, I didn't get them. But I love planting. I really love planting. So, it's fine to have these wonderful growing trees. I'm glad they're growing. But gosh, we could plant the whole thing over. I'm all in.
We described it the I Heart Baby Trees Club. It's been a real joy to be part of this panel today, the Women Owning Woodlands. And if you have more questions about managing small forests, we'll be here for the reception. We hope you'll come talk to us. And then if you have more specific questions about women owning woodlands, we have pamphlets out on the front desk, and they have just the website, all kinds of information about, that you can find out there. So thank you very much for being part of our podcast.